All right, welcome everybody, and to our final webinar. This is the fifth webinar for the sixth issue brief this week, talking about the Baltimore Community Change project. My name is Seema Iyer, and I'm going to give a brief overview about the project and what we found in this particular brief, and then turn it over to our respondents. I oversee the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, which is a great privilege. And what we do is produce the annual vital signs report for the city of Baltimore. It's over 100 different indicators for all of our communities. We've been doing this for 20 years, and we are the Baltimore partner of the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which is hosted by the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. The project that I'm going to talk about is not done just by us. We have an excellent BNIA team, but we're a small and mighty team that really want to congratulate all of our students that were part of this project. The funding that we got not only helped us bring in University of Baltimore students who are studying data science, but students around the country in public health, urban planning, and here at Johns Hopkins, at Morgan State, University of Michigan, and University of Illinois. And really thanks to all of them that we could produce the reports that we did. They all really brought a lot of great thought, a lot of great energy, and really helped us make sure that we could come see this project to fruition. So thanks to all of them. When the 2020 census came out in August, we obviously got one big blow for us as a city. We lost 5.7% of our population. But the other thing to kind of reflect on, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but maybe something in a galvanizing way, that we happen to be the only East Coast city to continue to lose population. It used to be we were in the same company with all of our sister cities across the country or up and down the East Coast, but now we're alone. And maybe that can help us kind of jog ourselves out of this fog that we might be in. And hopefully the data in these reports can help us do that as well. Looking at up and down the East Coast, our closest city, Philadelphia, gained 5% of their population, which is the biggest gain that Philadelphia has posted in 7 decades. So certainly something that we can think about in Baltimore, and hopefully the research that we put out for this work will help us figure out what the patterns were that caused the continued decline in our city. So for those of us that are familiar with Baltimore, this is unfortunately a very familiar pattern. The neighborhoods in blue are the ones that grew in terms of population, and the neighborhoods in red are the ones that declined in terms of population between 2010 and 2020. And as Dr. Lawrence Brown from Morgan State, has coined the term, the blue is predominantly white population, the white L, as he calls it, that grew, and the red areas are predominantly African-American neighborhoods that continued to decline. And if you looked at the previous decade, this is a very similar pattern. And so it becomes what's called a robust pattern. It happens over again. The neighborhoods that grew continued to grow, and the neighborhoods that declined continued to decline. And so we are pulling from a series of different kind of schools of thought that what we're experiencing in Baltimore is what's called enduring divergence. And that's the point of all of the research reports that we put. So enduring comes from the fact that places themselves have enduring properties. This comes from Robert Sampson's work, an urban sociologist now at Harvard, thinking about, even though we try to impact place also has its own properties and impacts us, that kind of dynamic from a sociological point of view. And then from an economic point of view, this is Enrico Morietti's work around the idea that places are diverging, fortunes are going in one direction, and misfortunes are unfortunately only going in the other. And this is occurring because cities and neighborhoods are exhibiting very strong, predictable network effects. So neighborhoods that are networked tend to get everything because they have this kind of thickness of the market, thickness of connections, thickness of information flow. And neighborhoods that are disconnected from any of these things, physical, social, digital, financial, are kind of just off the network. And once you're off the network, you can't even access the information that might be flowing in those networks. And I don't just mean through the internet, although the internet is a very serious problem for us. So if you looked at that pattern of where we saw population decline, they are disconnected from some of these other things that will only contribute to future decline if we don't change something now. And of course, unfortunately impacting existing neighborhoods of color. So that's the purpose of the project, is to really use data to empower us all to eliminate these kind of disparities, because it won't help any of us if some neighborhoods continue to grow while others continue to decline. All of us will fail in that kind of a situation. And the data is an act of empowerment, meant to help people really look at the information and make changes over the next decade. So we have 6 issue briefs. We've asked our respondents here today to help us talk about the last issue brief, which is all about quality of life. And really want to call out our graduate student from Johns Hopkins, Carla Tilchin, who pretty much wrote this one. Great work from her, and thinking about what were the indicators that were really relevant to include in this particular chapter. And we saw, actually, in many ways, some great news over the decade. Teenage birth rates declining, elevated blood levels declining, property crime actually did decline over the decade. Liquor store outlets, the density declined, and then the rate of dirty streets and alleys. Unfortunately, we had some negative trends also in terms of life expectancy. Our life expectancy actually went down as a city. We certainly had increases in violent crime and, unfortunately, gun-related crime. And I'm going to talk about these 2 in particular because, one is a great news story. We had literally declining teenage birth rates in practically every community. And this is certainly a national trend too, declining teenage birth rates. But the great news is kind of how dramatic it was in some of our communities that used to have very high rates of teenage birth rates. And really thinking about how we deployed our resources in this decade. One thing is that it does seem to be working where we do deploy resources. And maybe one cautionary tale is that the 3 communities that continue to have high rates of teenage birth rates do not have access to some of these federal qualified health centers, and maybe something for us to think about as we move into this next decade. Unfortunately, and we obviously have experts here in the call to talk about this rise in gun violence, but for those of us that were in Baltimore in 2015, this particular issue brief really certainly kind of gets at this idea that we experienced something in 2015 after the death of Freddie Gray, experienced something very traumatic for everybody. And many of our indicators have kind of this point of inflection at 2015 that we are not yet healed from, even 2020. And when the pandemic hit, we were kind of still in that, the trying to get out of whatever kind of traumatic situation that we were in. So I think that's something to think about and reflect on as a city as we move into this next decade. Like, how do we get out of and heal from so many traumatic things that happened to us in this past decade? And, it is the tale of 2 cities. Every single one of these change indicators, so all of our change indicators, you can get this kind of data interactively for anybody that's interested. Some neighborhoods saw dramatic declines in gun-related homicides and some dramatic increases. And we're all in the same city. And we have this kind of a shared fate. And how can we work together to make sure that we help each other and stop this kind of neighborhood disparity in the future? So welcome to our respondents. We're really excited to have Colin Starger from the University of Baltimore and Daniel Webster from Johns Hopkins. I'm going to turn it over to Colin first to give your 5-minute impressions on what we saw, and then I'll turn it over to Daniel after that. We're going to put the full bio in the chat, but for now, Colin Starger is professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law and currently serves as Associate Dean of Academic Affairs. Colin.
Thanks so much, Seema, and welcome to everyone. I'm glad to have the opportunity to respond to this issue brief, which was excellent. I'd like to start by first expressing my appreciation for the overall framing of the project. I really think that the enduring divergence notion, pulling together Moretti's work and Sampson's work is very useful. I also think the invocation in that sort of introductory brief of Jane Jacobs, warmed my heart. Her vision of true diversity in housing and neighborhoods was something that as an undergrad really inspired me, and it's very much the opposite of kind of the entrenched segregation that we've continued to see in the black butterfly, white L, as Dr. Brown calls it. I'd notice, I would sort of note that the focus on geography that is so much at the root of the BINIA's approach and these issue briefs is one that's also gaining currency in my field, in law. Just today, I was attending a book talk, and so was Heather Warnken, who's on this call from our new Criminal Justice Center, given by Professor Cheryl Cashin of Georgetown, who's written an excellent book. She's a law professor at Georgetown, called White Space, Black Hood, which focuses on the problems of opportunity hoarding, segregation, and surveillance. And so the approach that BINIA has been championing for a while is really beginning to gain traction in other fields, including my own, which makes me very happy. I'd say my own research, and probably the reason why SEMA has asked me to be here, is on the impact of the pretrial legal system and its sort of connection to this whole butterfly segregation problem. And I've got some specific thoughts on that that I'll give at the end of this. But the last thing that I'd like to express as appreciation for the overall frame is this empowerment frame. The idea that we should look not only at the good, not only at the bad, but also at the good, sort of focus on improvement as well as areas for improvement. And a reason for that I see is that if you only focus on the negative, not only is it kind of dispiriting, but you can enter into the realm of self-fulfilling prophecy. People have perceptions. They might leave Baltimore if they think that they perceive it to be bad. And then, as you ably point out in all the briefs, the problem of depopulation itself decreases the network's effects, itself causes the problem. So we really have to be careful in the way we talk about all this, that we don't only focus on the negative, that we do it in a way that empowers and leads us towards change. So with that said, you actually highlighted, Seema, one of the very first things that jumped out at me was not just that teen birth rate had decreased, and its specific, but also its specific connection that we see to the Title X federal centers, and more specifically, how the analysis that you can provide is we can literally map where they are, and the three CSAs that did show actual increase in teen birth rates, or not the right decrease that we have, didn't have access to those kind of clinics, right? No, I'm sure this wasn't a full regression that absolutely looked at the correlation, and I could tell that there was some care in that. But I think there's a common sense to the approach that we should be using these kind of maps, using this kind of data to guide where we're going to put resources, that we should put resources in areas that need it. We should prioritize that. We should buck against the trend of opportunity hoarding and just giving more and more resources to the communities that happen to have the political power, that happen to have the connections. And no one's ever going to argue that people shouldn't advocate for themselves, but it's just that when you have these communities that have these greater networked effects, that advocacy is going to go further. And what we should be looking at is a more data-driven approach, a more map-driven approach that simply looks at these patterns and says, you know what? We need a healthcare center in this place, right? Or we need a new school in this place, or a library in that place. We shouldn't be putting it, even though the political pressure is coming from these other areas. So that struck me as something that comes directly out of this issue brief. Another thing that came out is the urgency of looking at it. And specifically, you pointed to the decrease in our life expectancy. Sometimes we like to talk about percentage change over time and emphasize those numbers, but sometimes the raw numbers I find are more powerful. And the raw numbers on life expectancy, they're really disturbing, right? The neighborhood with the lowest life expectancy, approximately 63 years old. Somebody can expect to be live 63, where the highest is 85, right? I mean, that is a tremendous difference. It's as if the problems of structural racism and opportunity hoarding, or whatever you want to call it, are making an entire generation less in one neighborhood that's just miles away from another. And if that doesn't sort of force us to wake up and confront these things and ask ourselves whether the patterns of decision making that we've been adhering to, though it's changing somewhat, but that we've been by and large adhering to for these past decades, doesn't need a serious reconsideration, a more data-driven approach. I don't know what will, because that's a long time, 22 years, 21 and a half, but I'll call it 22. And the last thing, because I know we're supposed to keep our comments short, is I'd like to address the whole issue of gun violence and violence in general. And my old boss, Barry Scheck, used to talk about a saying, I forget who he attributed it to, but he'd say, if you want to change an institution, you have to change its paperwork, right? And here, this is not a critique of BINIA, but I'll just note that what isn't included in some of the research that's there is research on the workings of the criminal legal system, which is an area that I look at. So specifically, if we're looking at the population of the jail population in Baltimore and how it has fared over the years, and specifically over the past half decade, I'm very interested in, although over the whole decade, there definitely has been a decrease in jail population. Over the past half decade, it's remained steady despite a lot of high profile work on bail reform. And I raise this because when you're looking at what causes some of these problems, some of these inequalities that persist, you have to ask yourself, well, what do we have power over and what do we not have power over? And one of the things that we do have power over as a society is how many people we lock up behind bars. And there's a robust body of literature, and I'm sure Heather could contribute to this part of the conversation even more, that suggests that prisons and jails are themselves crimogenic. Rather than reducing crime through the possibility of incapacitation, which they do somewhat, in the longer run, they actually expose, let's call it the virus of violence, more people to it, and make it possible for that violence to sort of spread through communities, because many people are held in jail for long periods of time only to be released after all their charges are dropped and then go back out unceremoniously into the community, just having 30 days of their lives taken away. So I, for one, think that that's somewhat of an outrageous practice that needs a greater eye on it. And it's connected to these structures and systems that are so ably discussed in the report. And I'll leave my response at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. We will get back to this side of the we, who is we? Maybe that's something we could talk about. And then what is not only power, the power of information. Sometimes we have power over things, but we don't actually know things. And one of the things that the BINIA project has been all about is trying to unearth data so that we can even see some of these things for us all. I'm going to turn it over, but thank you very much, Colin. Daniel Webster is Professor of Health Policy and Management at Johns Hopkins University and Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research. Daniel, we're really grateful for you to be here as well.
Really happy to join you and want to congratulate you on these reports and briefs. They're really fantastic. And I have to also just note that Carla Tilton, who helped write this brief, is a student of mine and who is a key collaborator on a study we're doing now to study neighborhood trends in gun violence in Baltimore. In particular, we're focused on the impacts of safe streets, and I'll talk a little bit about that. One thing I want to start with, Colin did a lot of the hard work, frankly, of laying about a lot of these big issues and theories and how all of this, why we see the patterns that we do here. I'm going to sort of really take a focus on what I know best, which is the gun violence dimension of this. I want to say, while in every city, and obviously in Baltimore, there's enormous disparities in gun violence across neighborhoods that map on exactly as Colin was describing, map onto concentrated disadvantage, structural racism, those kinds of things. I want to note that the patterns that we see in gun violence in Baltimore honestly are not all that unique. We're the very sharp rise that we saw experience, frankly, the day after the uprising following Freddie Gray's death. It was like a 70% increase in shootings almost overnight. That did not subside. It wasn't a spike. It was sustained. These are patterns that you can see historically in other cities that have similar sort of cataclysmic kind of events that sort of, the event in itself is horrible, the loss of a life at the hands of the state. But they typically, it's a tinderbox of prior oppression and problems that really get magnified in this one particular thing, and things explode. And one thing that we know with public safety is that obviously it's generated not just by criminal legal systems, but to maintain safety, particularly from gun violence. It's what you see in your data, again, is consistent with a lot of national patterns right now, which is crime generally is going down, gun violence is the exception. Okay. This is incredibly important because, particularly when you think about all the other indicators that you're tracking here, in particular population loss, the social cost of gun violence is so much more than any other form of crime. The kind of fear that generates, the trauma that ripples through communities, families, whole entire metropolitan areas is really critical. So when gun violence in particular, gets really out of control, people flee those places. They flee those cities, but they particularly flee, as you've documented here, the neighborhoods where it is most concentrated. And it was in those very neighborhoods where this explosion, in essence, between the police and criminal legal system and the community really, exposed all these problems. And both of these entities are backing away from one another. Okay, so generally, that's not a good thing. It would be a great thing if we didn't need police, but particularly in areas with lots of other problems, I would argue that police are needed, but how they police it is incredibly important. It must be, in essence, with the trust and support of the people who in those communities. And again, I think that was sort of what was fractured there. What is changing over this time that might be generating these trends? Well, I'm going to say something that maybe it seems just sort of so basic, but I think it's easy to lose sight of it. But it is more guns in more places. Just to be honest, that is a national phenomenon. But again, I think it's magnified in times of crisis. That's one reason why we see gun violence as a contagious process. Shootings happen, people get scared. What do? They reach for a gun. They want to make sure they have a gun when they go out. Just, one of the lead stories in the Baltimore Sun today, a conviction for a murder in McElderry Park. Very sad situation. 21-year-old young man lost his life. And one of the attorneys basically said, all three people in this altercation, it wasn't a planned murder. It was somebody got mad at one another. All three men had guns on them. So rather than a punch thrown, someone loses their life. It's clear in the data in Baltimore, but I think in a number of cities, that gun carrying is becoming far more common. And when that occurs, you're going to see more people being shot. Now, the response on the criminal legal system is really critical here. We don't want broad, racially biased stop and search kind of practices. That's going to undermine exactly the sort of trust that I was saying is so critical here. But there is still, in essence, there's some sorting to be done of who's actually driving the shootings. Some people are carrying guns simply because they're scared, and some, frankly, are shooters. That's just, frankly, what the data say. And so we need to transform our systems accordingly so that they're not designed to racially profile and just broadly use those sort of tactics. We need completely different kind of approaches that are very sort of intel driven, and really trying to address those things. And we don't need super long sentences, but we need some real response to that violence. And what we're seeing here is, whether it's clearance rates or any other metric, the most serious forms of gun violence, we're seeing less consequence for. So, I'm not a mandatory minimum guy. I'm actually the opposite. I'll hope people will look at a report that we put out in 2020 that kind of pulls all of these things together. I somehow have gotten through this chat without mentioning the gun trace task force, but of course that is on many people's minds as like that's like one of the worst examples of police corruption in our nation's history, perhaps. So we need different models, but to think that we can't or shouldn't police illegal gun possession, I think, is wrong. So we just have to reform those systems so that they are, again, driven more by the violence and not by demographics or even locations on the map. Last thing I'll just say is some people, the perception is, well, okay, the police aren't doing their job so well, so let's just have more safe streets, right? The violence interrupters. I'm all for more safe streets and for strengthening those programs. People need to understand that for the longest time, they've been in a very small part of the geography of Baltimore, even within the redder parts of our maps. And it's only very recently that we've gotten up to 10 neighborhoods, not in the larger CSA kind of neighborhoods that you use. So we have a long way to go before we have an infrastructure of community violence intervention that's going to be sort of, in essence, an alternative to, policing this problem. So we have a long way to go. I just want people to understand for investment in community violence intervention to address this problem. I'm encouraged by the direction, but I want people to understand we have a long way to go with our investment in community violence intervention. And I'll stop there.
So, I am neither a criminal justice expert nor a gun violence expert, but I'm a neighborhood expert. And the thing about that is that every single issue comes to a neighborhood, right? Whether we're talking about picking up the trash or whether we're talking about vacant and abandoned housing, or if we're talking about gun violence or whatever. And you can see that neighborhoods are grappling with a suite of issues upon which gun violence now is impacting, absolutely, as you're saying, this contagion. You can see from the data, the neighborhoods that grew in terms of gun violence are not the inner neighborhoods. They're actually further flung, like Pimlico and Edmondson Village, which are not normally what we would think of as high gun violence neighborhoods. But so this idea of the contagion is really is bearing itself out, unfortunately, and can only lead to this, more divergence, right? More kind of divergence in experiences in the city. So when we talk about the we that you brought up, Colin, like, how do we change these things? What are some advice for you for neighborhoods as we move into next week?
Well, I think having that sense of we is in a way a first step, like being able to connect and collaborate and not only work, whether, if you're an academic, don't work in an academic silo and only speak to people that are already in your field. And not just work in an academic silo in terms of fields, but also in terms of getting out and meeting with people and working with people that are connected to the community, that are connected to institutions of government, to civil service, civil society. All of these things are important. I think that in a way we see the similar patterns of segregation in our fields of inquiry as we do in our neighborhoods, and it's just not helpful. I think that's got to be part of it, and people can learn, from each other. So there, it's very important. Not just, I was really glad to hear Daniel tell it is a tragic story, but to tell an individual story of how gun violence plays out and the particular circumstances of that. So it's not just abstract. Sometimes academics will only think about it abstractly, but it's really important to be in conversation with people that are experiencing it directly. And similarly, let's say judges might have, they often share this concern around gun violence, but they don't have that sophisticated understanding that Daniel was talking about, that really it's a very, very small number of people that are the shooters, and many other people, yes, they might have a gun, but they're just doing it because they're scared. But to lock them up without looking into any of those circumstances and just on we have to stop it, is not going to make the problem better, right? So trying to increase our literacy overall of how we can read and understand the data, but also connect it to individual stories, I'd say that's part of what we should be doing.
Can I share just a little piece of the study that we published in 2020 that I think is relevant here? We did household surveys in the parts of East and West Baltimore with the most concentrated, worst problems with gun violence. And we asked them a series of questions about the problem, and particularly how they perceive the police response to that problem. One of the things that I thought was so particularly interesting was that from their perception that a lot of people carrying guns was a problem, a lot of stop and search practices that sort of people honestly were divided about half or said, that's okay, that's fine, because I don't want people carrying stuff. Other people said, no, that's crazy, that's biased and horrible. But the thing that was particularly interesting was 70% or so said, but the police don't actually get to the people who are driving the violence. They are not bothering them, they're bothering everybody else. To really underscore this really fundamental aspect of how we approach this problem. Do you see this, oh, that's a bad neighborhood, right? Well, no, within that neighborhood, you have a small number of people who are generating a lot of violence, right? And that should be our orientation to community safety. So all the other things that are so important to community viability can then take shape. People can invest in homes and businesses and those kind of things. But if there's a small number of people creating a lot of havoc and death and violence, it's not going to happen. So we have to hold our police accountable for that they're not allowing those communities to thrive like they could.
This was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of a conversation that we hope to keep going next week. And I hope all of you join us next week. Stay connected with us as we move into a series of community conversations. We also have fun ways to get to know each other. Exactly as Colin said, we have to actually break out of our own silos and find connections. So tonight is neighborhood trivia. So if you want to learn about other neighborhoods and see how well you do with people from around the city that are interested in neighborhood trivia as well, please join us tonight. And all of you, thank you, Colin.